Open this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Affairs inquiry into economic self-determination and opportunities for First Nations Australians. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of lands from which we meet today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend this respect to all mob who are here today and acknowledge their cultural and spiritual connections to Australia's lands and waters. I remind all senators and members that proceedings are to be conducted in a respectful and courteous way. I remind senators and members that this is a workplace, and this is especially true for public officials and stakeholders who are present before us. It is essential that they are treated with respect and that they feel safe when they present to our hearings. As Chair, I will be particularly vigilant in ensuring cultural safety for First Nations people and culturally and emotionally marginalised groups during these hearings. In accordance with the Committee's resolution on the 7th of September 2022, this hearing will be broadcast on Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the inquiry's website. I remind members of the media who may be listening in on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report proceedings of the committee. I now welcome representatives from Australian National University First Nations portfolio to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you, Senator. My name is Peter Yu. I'm the Vice President of the First Nations portfolio at the Australian National University. Just for the record, I have a couple of other roles that I'm playing currently at the moment, but may or may not have have really no bearing on the nature of my comments here today. So I chair the Rio Tinto Australian Advisory Group, post-Juukan Gorge, and I'm currently one of 3 expert panel members on the review of the North Australian infrastructure facility happening at this moment. But I'm here as a professor in practice at the Australian National University.
Thank you for those declarations, Professor. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement of hopefully no longer than 2 minutes, because I'm sure committee members have got lots of questions for you for you to be able to get your evidence on the record. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chair. My opening remarks really, I'd like to start off by recognising the traditional owners of the land where I'm here in Canberra, the Ngunnawal Ngambri people, but also to point towards the comments of the Prime Minister at the Gama conference in August, early August this year, when he said, and he quoted me from a previous statement I've had said, that Australia has never pursued a comprehensive economic policy for First Nations. The Prime Minister also followed that up with saying that the government was up to the challenge, and that basically said that we know where the old road leads us and we have to move on to a new pathway, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. So fundamentally, the First Nations portfolio of the last 3 years has facilitated an international economic empowerment symposium, and last year, 2023, a 6-part seminar series which involved industry, policymakers, experts and Indigenous leaders on how best to advance economic opportunities. As a result of that, and I was submitted to this committee the Muru Waru Outcomes Report about improving the lives of Indigenous life outcomes requires developing innovative economic and fiscal responses that drive wealth creation. I should say from the start, so that there's no question about it, the nature of the imperatives that drives the sustaining of Aboriginal cultural and customary practice and culture is fundamental and intrinsical to the nature of the question of economic empowerment. So there should be no question that while I will be discussing and talking and answering your questions in relation to economic empowerment, the whole centrality and piece of the resilience and sustainability of Aboriginal culture and practices is underpinned by the nature of this important change in the relationship. So the report is not a blueprint, but it's a starting point for policy discussions across key areas, namely access to capital, looking at how to activate the accumulated assets, and simultaneously building capacity building in Aboriginal corporations and organisations. Economic and fiscal reforms should complement the social policy efforts in closing the gap. This is we have witnessed and seen the Productivities Commission's responses in relation to the targets on the National Partnership Agreement for closing the gaps, and are calling for a different pathway and new reforms. So the investment in closing the gaps is obviously essential. There are, however, very serious and systemic impediments, barriers that prevent the nature of being able to get the results that everybody wishes to see. So the economic development is has to be seen as being complementary to the nature of the investment in trying to improve the lives of Aboriginal people nationwide. This is not an assimilationist policy, economic policy, but it is underscored by a commitment of the rights from UNDRIP, and particularly, of course, self-determination and FPIC. So basically, this is the first time that the establishment of the First Nations Economic Empowerment Alliance, emerging out of the symposium and seminar series, working with key leaders from Indigenous organisations, have convened to drive this agenda, both with government and with industry. And I've mentioned already the Prime Minister's speech, saying that economic development must be a priority. On the cusp of energy transitions, the future made in Australia, we must emerge as genuine actors and contributors in the Australian economy, in the local, regional and national economy. Failure to advance the economic policy position for Indigenous people will see the gap remain, and this work, of course, must be done in true partnership with Indigenous leaders. So those are my opening remarks, Senator. I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you very much for that, and I'll now go to Senator Ghosh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Professor Yu, for appearing before this inquiry. One of the observations that was made in your submission was that the Closing the Gap framework has not substantially improved economic outcomes for First Nations people, and I take from part of your opening statement that it perhaps has not got that as its primary focus. How could a strengthened national economic agenda improve First Nations economic participation and the long-term wealth aggregation amongst First Nations peoples?
The history of public policy administration in regards to Indigenous affairs over the last 6 years, and beyond that, of course, I think we know what the nature of the history of colonisation has been. But I believe that the policy framework has been around a social deficit approach in relation to seeing Aboriginal people as welfare mendicants, living off the kind of public largesse and handout. This has been particularly as a result of historical decisions, both going back to the 1967 referendum, but of course the 1968 pastoral award wages, I think, is a classic example of how ill-thought and ill-prepared planned policy has contributed to the nature of the ongoing marginalisation and impoverishment of Aboriginal people. The circumstances have now changed. That has not yet been recognised, post, of course, 1976 with the Northern Territory Land Rights Act and subsequently the Mabo decision in 1994, the Native Title Act, where we now have an accumulated asset base nationally of about 60% of direct, indirect Aboriginal interest in land assets, and across Northern Australia that would represent anything plus 80% upwards. The problem is, of course, the ability to activate these assets in a way that there can be, I guess, a move away from the programmatic approach towards Aboriginal affairs policy to looking at the whole question of wealth creation, wealth transfer, rather than what we have at the moment is transfer of trauma to our community as an ongoing result of colonisation. But clearly, I would suggest, Senator, that that question really lies with the nature of the government in respect of the National Partnership Agreement. But I would have thought that historically economic development in Aboriginal program terms has only been very limited towards the question of employment and jobs, and not towards the question of a broader fiscal approach in the relationship that looks at the question of how do we leverage the government's balance sheet to be able to look at the question of flow of capital and also the deployment of that capital. I think if I might refer to the Associate Professor Michelle Evans's snapshot report from Melbourne University in April this year, she, in her research, has indicated that things are changing quite dramatically in terms of the engagement in business by Aboriginal communities and businesses. In 2022, her overview of the Indigenous ecosystem was revenue based of about $16.096 billion. Contribution in wages nationally was about $4.2 billion. Aboriginal business employed 116,795 people, and there were currently active businesses of over 13,500 businesses. I think this is fairly indicative. And recent conversations that I've had with, particularly in the Queensland area, with local shires, where particularly in the Aboriginal Shire Councils, the last election saw a majority of new leadership approach to around about 60% of members being under the age of 40, and most of those local government councils are talking about wealth creation and wealth transfer, and looking at particular ways in which to engage government and both industries about how that might occur.
You referred to capital flows and capital availability in terms of one of the things that government can be involved in. Would that be your priority, or what you would see the Commonwealth Government prioritise, or are there other things that the Commonwealth Government should also have top of its list?
There's not necessarily one thing, and there's no kind of any silver bullet, but there is a silver lining. I think the issue of capital is critical, but I think we need to understand the kind of landscape in which we're operating in. So quoting those figures, I think that clearly indicates that what we're looking at is probably small to medium-sized businesses that are emerging. I think there are still historical and other barriers that exist in terms of accessing finance from normal financial institutions, banks, etc. I think there is still a level of discrimination that exists and prejudice in relation to, if you look at some anecdotal cases have been around very successful Aboriginal startup business, but when they want to scale up, have great difficulty trying to access capital. I think also if you look at the historical nature of policy, it's been about an engagement strategy rather than how do we look at what the nature of the merits are of the actual investment. I think the other point is that, sorry, my mind's just slipped there. You asked about flow of capital. I think the question of building capability in organisation, so there's a number of things that need to happen simultaneously. One is, even though we've got, as I mentioned, those percentages of land assets, we have very little capability in our corporations. That's emerging, but in our prescribed body corporates, who are the statutory or regulatory bodies holding a native title in trust, have very little resources in terms of being able to adequately interface and participate with third-party interests, seek to access and use their lands for economic development. So I think there's a question of building, investing in governance and management capability. I think there is a need to look at this question of whether or not the existing, how does the existing government special investment vehicles are considerate of the nature of how it might provide the flow of capital. Should there be a particular carve-off considered? It's a kind of bit of a chicken and egg situation because we are emerging in these businesses, and we need to obviously ensure that there is the, supporting the developing pipeline of projects, so that we can talk about real terms about what the kind of deal flows might be, but also the question of how do we move towards looking at equity propositions rather than, as I say, this whole question of program dollars, because that hasn't worked. We need a new fiscal relationship with government, which is about this question of access, flow and deployment of capital.
In relation to, you've referred to it in your opening statement and in that answer, and one of the submissions we've heard or themes we've heard in this inquiry is that there are limits and constraints on the way in which First Nations people can maximise the economic benefit of land rights and native title rights. How could the Commonwealth Government better enable First Nations landholders to leverage their land and economic assets? And if I might ask that at two levels, first is within the existing legal framework, and then the second is if that legal framework is currently inadequate, what are the changes that would best facilitate that ability to leverage the underlying asset for the benefit of First Nations people?
There's no doubt that there's a level of complication and complexity to the, and if I refer to particularly the Future Act processes, which I guess is a formal process under the Native Title Act that enables negotiations to happen for third-party proponents looking to develop something on Aboriginal land. I think the matter you're referring to is not, but people talk about the fungibility of native title. I think there perhaps is an issue, but I think we can look at examples and precedents which have been set elsewhere that where, particularly in Canada, but in Australia, I think that there is an opportunity to look at the question of long-term leases on Aboriginal land without the notion of extinguishment. I think this is a barrier because I think at the moment there's the requirements of the nature of impact on native title causes great consternation and angst for all Aboriginal people because we find that the notion of extinguishing native title as a repugnant notion, given that as the first peoples of this country, that somehow our title should be distinguished or extinguished or diminished by nature of being able to activate those assets to provide the benefit return. I think the question of, for me, I think it's more a question of structural impediments that operate between the Commonwealth and the state and the nature of the processes to move towards a much more amicable, I guess, agreed process. I think there are issues, impediments structurally. I think that at the moment, if you look at the process there where you look at a third-party interest wanting to come on Aboriginal land, the first thing is that you lodge an application and Aboriginal people have to lodge an objection to that to trigger the mediation to try and arrive at an ILUA as the end point of those discussions. There are practical ways of dealing with that, I think, but it requires significant investment in relation to providing those corporations with adequate information to be able to develop their own data initiative, through the Indigenous Data Initiative, to be able to have that as a capacity in their own organisations so that they're able to have some level of equity around the negotiating table when it comes to the kind of resources required to arrive at an agreed position. I think we don't have that at the moment, and so many organisations are struggling just to meet their daily administration needs. So I think that needs to be done. So build capability in organisations so they're able to negotiate. I think looking at the question of long-term leases that is able to protect the kind of investment interest in relation to risk. I think at the end, in the long term, in regards to this whole question of fungibility, there's absolutely no reason why the government couldn't consider an Indigenous freehold title that does not extinguish native title but has all of the characteristics available to it in respect to negotiating commercial and other development interest on its land. I think we should, it's important to look at international precedences, and I think Canada is a very good example in Australia when we talk about these matters. I think to look at this, I think Canada is probably about 20 or 30 years ahead of Australia in a whole lot of ways, but particularly in this economic, what they call economic reconciliation, what we might be calling economic empowerment, where they have, in fact, in 2005, the Canadian Fiscal Management Act set up statutory organisations that are there to support building capacity, providing the capital access, and providing the level of coordination in respect to those Aboriginal communities and corporations being able to fully participate in the economy. I think that's an important precedent example that we in Australia should be looking at. I could give you an example from their last budget. As an example, the headline items from the last Canadian budget was the announced funding for Indigenous initiatives, which is valued at about $9.062 billion for the next 5 fiscal years. And what they are basically doing is they are, and I can provide this brief to the committee, but the next 2 years, $12.6 billion to Indigenous Service Canada to continue implementing and advancing new fiscal relationship with First Nation communities. There's $275 million over the next 2 years to maintain Indigenous governance and capacity programs and support governance capacity development. They're also looking at a $5 billion loan guarantee to unlock access to capital for Indigenous communities, creating economic opportunities and supporting economic development priorities. So just a couple of quick examples. There's another one, $16.5 million over the next 2 years to support capacity funding for Indigenous communities and applicants in the delivery of that Indigenous loan guarantee program. There's also consideration of a resource carve-off in relation to a resource tax for Indigenous communities. So there's a whole range of different initiatives by the Canadian government, but they've come also under the critical kind of structural reforms putting in place to organisations that are capable of delivering those reforms.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your evidence.
Thanks, Senator Ghosh. I'll now hand to the Deputy Chair, Ms Price.
Thank you, Chair, and hello to Peter. I'm talking to you from beautiful Geraldton today, overlooking the Indian Ocean, but last week I was in the Kimberley, which I know is dear to you, so thanks very much for being with us today. One of the things I was going to talk about is really the approach by the Canadian government, and you've just given an excellent overview of at least their last budget. Do you have any information about what results they're getting as a consequence of their sort of approach to helping First Nations people to be able to be economically independent?
I think when this was first touted prior to 2005, there was some level of scepticism about the communities that were signed up to be accredited. So the whole kind of principle around this is in the establishment of the 2005 Fiscal Management Act, and particularly the establishment of the First Nations Financial Management Board, was to develop a process of accreditation for those Aboriginal communities wanting to move away from the, I guess the Canadian, whatever the formal title is, the Indian Affairs Act, to look at how they might participate in the local and regional economy, and how how the Financial Management Board might be able to facilitate them doing that. So they're required an accreditation for that, and there was, I think they now have, from the last couple, 20 years or so, now they have something like 360 odd member organisations that have started up. I don't have any. I can certainly help to provide further details of that, but the Financial Management Authority, not only in respect to the $5 billion loan guarantee facility which they manage, but have also been able to issue debentures worth a number of millions of dollars over the last 10 years or so, not just necessarily accessible by First Nations communities, but also by external private investors as well too. So I think, without having the full details in front of me, I think what it has done though is demonstrated that there has been a clear success. I think the national pipeline has seen a major equity investment by Aboriginal corporations in Canada worth billions of dollars. But I'm happy to provide you with a list of other achievements. We in fact have an MOU with our Canadian counterparts, which was signed in 2023, November 2023, and we have regular quarterly hookups with them so that we can continue to learn from the precedences that they're setting. And in fact, that relationship was initiated with an invitation with several, and the lead person, Harold Keller, who's the executive chair of the Financial Management Board, actually attending our conference, seminar series and symposium. And I think the Financial Management Board has made a submission to to this inquiry as well too.
So, apart from Canada, are you able to identify any other jurisdictions, that Australia can learn from, that it is actually helping to drive economic self-determination? I mean, what about New Zealand? Are they getting it right?
I think, well, I mean, obviously they're underpinned by the nature of the Treaty of Waitangi, which has provided leverage based on the kind of settlements agreements that have been achieved by respective groups. But also, I think I'm not entirely familiar with the New Zealand situation, but I do know that they also face significant challenges, as we do in Australia, in trying to provide the nature of proper support in terms of the social conditions. The housing is particularly difficult, as it is in Australia, as well as the health and other associated kind of, closing the gap measures, I suppose, that they have in New Zealand. So I guess I think this is an interesting question because, yes, there would be important precedences, but there's still a long way to go, and how you actually I guess, build simultaneous to try and building the kind of economic platform is to what are the kind of social institutions that need to be built to deliver the social benefits to those communities. And I think we're faced with the same thing, but I'm afraid I can't give you any more greater detail than that at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Ms Chaney.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr Yu. I'd love to hear more about your ideas on a new fiscal arrangement, and you mentioned a carve-out of some sort. What would new fiscal arrangements look like?
Currently, at the moment, as I say, we're kind of stuck in this kind of hole with the. No, I shouldn't say that really. We're stuck basically dealing with the National Partnership Agreement and closing the gap. The kind of new fiscal relationship is more about the structural reform issues. It's about the question of identifying how are we to... And part of that structural reform is at the moment we've got the IBA and ILSC. An example would be the IBA currently and the ILSC, who receive a kind of annual appropriation, but the ILSC, with the 2018 and 19 amendments to their Act, now have their funds, which is about $2 billion sitting in the Australia Future Fund. So they have a statutory framework in which to operate in the drawdown. But other than that, the kind of availability of cash to be able to look at seeding capital and then to scaling up, looking at the question of being able to look at having a greater equity in major projects. What we're talking about is a very limited programmatic way of delivering economic change, and that isn't working. That's been in place for the last 60 odd years. What we're talking about is the structural reform issues about what should the relationship between government and Aboriginal communities look like. The greatest difficulty I think we have really is because of the way that the kind of federation is structured, is because the money that is provided is largely mainly Commonwealth money provided for Closing the Gap and other programs, but it's distributed through the state and territory agencies. But what we do need to do is have our own Aboriginal structures. We need to be able to, I guess, as they do in Canada, is to try and leverage what the government's balance sheet is so that we can look at freeing up how we structure this flow of capital to Aboriginal corporations.
Can you be more specific about how you could leverage the government's balance sheet, or you know, what that would look like? Is it about funding for PBCs, or you know, what does it? What's a practical example of what that would look like? Well,
at the moment, the only two organisations are IBA, Indigenous Business Australia, and ILSC. They have very specific statutory responsibilities. So both of them are cashed out at the moment. They can't go and access a private capital because of the risk issues. What I'm talking about fundamentally is if, for instance, and a practical example might be in the kind of transition to renewables, if we look at what's happening in the Pilbara, where you have an energy integrated system, you have 4 providers. You have Horizon Power, which is a state provider. You have FMG, you have BHP, and you have Rio. They have their own generation and transmission capacities. The question of whether or not the traditional owner interest in the Pilbara might be able to buy equity into that, into the infrastructure, in the generation and transmission, as a way of ensuring that there is, rather than just a reliant on the particular royalties that they might get from their agreements, they might have an ongoing interest in that infrastructure and the nature of how they might seek to better optimise the nature of those returns in those communities. The question of, if I might look at another example, the Kimberleys, at the moment, there are about 30 Aboriginal properties, which represents about 33% of the pastoral estate. That represents about 7 million hectares. They operate as individual units. Most of them are marginal. If that, I think that's probably true. Or some of them are non-viable, so there needs to be a whole rationalisation. The 7 million hectares represents an investment and growth opportunity collectively, but also individually. They have very limited access to other capital other than normal finance, which is probably, given they operate on a debt cycle, would bring no confidence in terms of risk to other financiers to be able to provide that, so they could comprehensively develop the nature of the economy based on their collective and individual interest in the Kimberley.
So being able to consolidate, for example, those properties and then leverage that property, is that for capital? I'm just trying to understand where the money flows go in a new fiscal relationship.
That's right. It's about that. Well, if you take, for instance, the nature, that example would be in the Kimberleys. It's about improving the management and productivity levels. It's about looking at questions of diversification, whether that be in relation to management of biodiversity, whether it's looking at offset programs, whether it's looking at cultural tourism programs, whether it's all those kind of things are there, the opportunities there, but there's absolutely no clear line of sight in terms of being able to access the capital.
Because they're fragmented and held by different bodies?
No, because people won't people won't back them because it's Aboriginal and they see them as they need to build capability, and because people think it's too much of a risk, they won't get their money back.
Okay, so building the capability inside PBCs to enable them to then negotiate and enter into different economic arrangements.
Yeah, absolutely. But
and so does that include then operational funding for PBCs? Because I think there's not much at the moment, is there?
I think the maximum amount is about $50,000 or $60,000 that are currently provided by NIA to the PBCs. Unless you're a PBC that's in the Pilbara or somewhere else that has some form of mining or other activity on it, that you're able to draw additional kind of income from agreement sources. But other than that, majority of PBCs don't have that kind of level of resources.
Mm. So would you provide? I'm just trying to work out how to do that without it being programmatically based and part of an old way of doing things. If you're funding, providing operational funding for PBCs, but you're talking about doing that not on a programmatic level, but through greater access to leveraging the land asset. Am I misunderstanding that?
No, that's right. The question is, how do you leverage those assets, and what level of available capital is there to be able to do that, and how is that to be deployed, and under what circumstances, so that you're able to ensure that you can protect your native title rights and interests without jeopardising the nature of impairment or extinguishment. Secondly, it's about how do you, because most of those PBC's priorities are really looking towards the kind of social considerations. Most PBCs will be saying, well, what do we do about the housing situation, given that we still have 10 to 15 people crowded in accommodations right across this country? How do we juxtapose the nature of building our investment and return capacity through leveraging our assets, while at the same time being able to build capability in providing the necessary support for our communities, for housing, for jobs, for all those kinds of things that everybody naturally expects, but Aboriginal people yet at this stage can't achieve for it. I think there was a recent article, if I might point to it, in the National Indigenous Times on the 27th, which announced the establishment of the Northern Territory Aboriginal Investment Corporation and launching its 2024-29 plan after about 60 or so odd years since the Aboriginal Benefits Accounts was established under the Northern Territory Land Rights Act to receive mining royalty equivalents, both from the agreements with mining companies, but also from the federal government meeting those equivalents. So this is the first time where they've established this investment corporation, which is strictly based upon trying to establish confidence and build capability in local Aboriginal businesses. So they're not just receiving these investments, but they are also very much in control of making the decisions, and where they're starting to, and quoted by Barbara Shaw, the chair, saying, we're not just the recipients of these investments, we are the decision makers and builders of wealth for our future generations. So this will be strictly on normal investment terms, working to build capability in their corporations to take part in the local economy.
So more of that. I mean, that's you're saying that's that's a step in the right direction in terms of focusing on building capability.
This is not going to happen overnight. The situation has to be, there has to be a structural change around it so that you can actually work with the corporations to build their capability in governance and management. But that shouldn't deny them the ability to participate in the economy by not having readily available access to capital. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation where we're saying that yes, there is a developing pipeline. It's not mature at the moment, but it will grow. Just think about the critical mineral space. I mean, given that if you take Northern Australia, for example, nearly 80 to 100% of the land is Aboriginal land. Where are you going to find the critical minerals and special minerals? It's going to be on Aboriginal land. Look historically over the last 100 years in terms of other commodities, particularly iron ore, but where has that delivered any significant change to the circumstances of those communities? Sure, there are some trusts, quite substantial trusts, say for instance in the Pilbara, but then you look under that and see, well, what are the changes to the housing, education, health? And basically things have remained the same. So there is a critical factor in how you build the governance capability and where you invest that in. There are studies in the US, mainly through Harvard University and working with the University of Arizona, been working on this for the last 20 years, which have clearly indicated the most successful of those Aboriginal communities have been successful because of the strength of their cultural authority. There are a lot of other successful, inverted commas, Aboriginal organisations in the US and through the kind of setting up of these casinos, but they haven't delivered the outcomes for their communities. So they've made a lot of money but not been very successful in terms of dealing with the question of the social disadvantage and economic marginalisation. So their studies have shown clearly that where there has been, evidence of great success has been where they have been driven by the Aboriginal communities themselves and are controlled by them.
Thank you. Just changing topic slightly, the Closing the Gap agreement, can you tell us more about the lack of economic empowerment or whether action is needed to review that approach?
Well, I think under the National Partnership Agreement, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the coalition of peaks who are in charge of this, but my understanding is that their focusing on the National Partnership Agreement economic development is pretty much focused towards the question of skills and jobs and training, whereas the proposition of the alliance that we've brought together is that we're taking a broader scope, which is about some of the things I've been talking about. But I think the critical difficulty, no matter what it is, whether it be the economic approach through employment on training, or whether it be any of the other stuff, is really something to be very concerned about in respect that we haven't been able to go anywhere near closing the gap targets that were intended. And I think, therefore, there's a structural issue that is not being considered at the moment, and that's clearly what the delivery mechanism is between the Commonwealth and the state and the territories. I mean, it amazes me.
Specifically on economic participation or on closing the gap broadly?
Well, I'm speaking broadly, but I think I'm a bit sceptical. How many years there have been investment in jobs and training and over the last 60 odd years of public administration? And why haven't we moved anywhere near celebrating some greater successes? So I'm a bit sceptical, but that's probably my natural nature, being in Aboriginal affairs for the last 40 years.
And then one more question. With Canada, and you talked about Canada being 20 or 30 years ahead on economic empowerment, or economic reconciliation, sorry. Why do you think that is? And is UNDRIP and the approach to UNDRIP they've taken in Canada either a cause or a symptom of or a result of being so far ahead?
No, I think historical initially. I think obviously you have treaty communities, and then you have in British Columbia you have modern day treaties. I think the critical thing that has changed Canada in 1982 when they repatriated the Constitution, they reaffirmed they reaffirmed the nature of the standing the historical treaties. I think they also had an understanding that they would, any changes to that environment would only be through negotiation and by agreement. They don't have a special measure clause in the Constitution that can be used in a deficit position against Aboriginal, as it has been done in this country. I think that the residential school situation had a major impact on the nature of the attitude of Canadians generally. I think the 1996 Royal Commission in regards to the conditions of Aboriginal people in Canada had a major influence. I think the question is that there's been strong local and national leadership by the Canadian Indigenous leaders. I think that, in fact, having spent time there last year, July, and spoken to the director of the Crown Aboriginal Relations Committee, which is a federal agency in Canada, said that the major change, practical change, really happened when all of the heads of the departments in the Canadian governments started to appreciate the nature and the value of First Nations Canadian communities' participation in the local economy and the importance that was to Canadian economy. And I think that when the light went on, that filtered down throughout all of their ranks, where the bureaucracy became a lot more attuned and connected to the nature of what was happening. Because I think, and I think that's where we're not at here in Australia, as we haven't yet had the buy-in of the bureaucracy in terms of their understanding and appreciation of the critically important changes that are happening in Aboriginal community. I mean, we are now, it's taken us, we've never had an economic policy. It's taken us over 60 years of public administration policy in Aboriginal affairs to even be talking about economic development. I mean, that sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? That we somehow haven't been able to consider, well, largely because we don't consider Aboriginal people as being equal and capable contributors to our society in Australia. We still retain a significant amount of prejudice and discrimination, and that's true. We have to accept that. Things might be changing, but they're changing very slowly. So it's incumbent upon government to help facilitate that change by building the right structures around and investing simultaneously in the capability of Aboriginal organisations and peoples, while at the same time leading the kind of national policy. We haven't had a major policy change in Australia for 30-odd years, since Mabo, since the Native Title Act. You know, and which included the Indigenous Land Corporation then, and the Land Fund. And there was a third part, of course, that didn't get up in 1996, which, of course, is the Social Justice Package. So, you know, how can we possibly justify the nature of the enormous amount of money coming out of the Pilbara, which is the economic driver of GDP in Australia, when you've got a prison, Roban prison, with 99% Aboriginal faces? You've got, you know, the epicentre of wealth generation probably in the globe. How do we justify that? I find that extraordinary. That and that's our situation in Australia. But I'm not here to make political statements. I think basically what we have is fundamentally an economic apartheid approach, largely governed by inability of governments to think more creatively and a lack of attention to this by our executive. And I think that we are clearly demonstrating things are happening. We're not expecting the government to do everything for us. We're expecting a bit of a fair go. And if we haven't had policy changes in 30 years, that means we haven't had any structural reform issues that go along with policy change. And that's what needs to happen today.
Thank you, Chair. No more questions from me.
Thank you. I don't disagree with some of your observations so far, Professor. I wanted to understand, I know that you've done a bunch of work engaging with mob from across the country. Has that included the Torres Strait mob? And I suppose I'm kind of wondering if there's any differences from the islands to the mainland in terms of what their kind of needs might be, kind of what it is we might need to do there in particular to support the economic aspiration of, Torres Strait mob.
Torres Strait people were certainly involved in the symposium and the seminar series, and obviously spoke very specifically to their circumstances there. I would say that they face the same challenges as other Indigenous peoples on the mainland. I think there are matters that are very peculiar and characteristically only Torres Strait, obviously, and obviously it seems to be from their, and I'm not an expert in the Torres Strait, but certainly their whole concern about the nature of climate change and the rising seawaters presents an enormous amount of challenge for them there in terms of their cultural and social and economic, abilities and imperatives that drive the sustaining of their communities.
Yeah. Are you able to? You can let me know if you're not able to do this, but on notice, kind of pull out from the seminars what was kind of specific in terms of the particulars for the Torres Strait mob in their contributions to the symposiums. Are you able to pull that data out or no?
I'm not sure that we specifically identified Torres Strait rather than broader, more the kind of the industries and economies associated with the sea and the seas around the Torres Strait, and the particular industries that are there or not there, and what they can certainly look at that. But I don't know that we've actually isolated anything very specific in relation to Torres Strait Islands.
No, that's okay. Thank you. The next question I've got is about something you've said in your submission, which talks to improving support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait businesses. What are some of the specifics in terms of supports you think that are required there?
First of all, I think there's a lot of agencies that are out there, like Commonwealth and state, territory, and also organisations that are there to help not just Aboriginal people, but I guess anybody in the community to establish and develop their businesses and develop their business case. And I think people are very confused about knowing where to go, to prepare a business case, develop a business plan, to be able to look at where they might, first of all, be able to attract some initial seeding money in it, and also to look at what are the kind of wraparound support services. I think, generally speaking, that's applicable to many Aboriginal businesses. I've heard successful Aboriginal small businesses that have been established and say they're very happy to just go to the bank and try and get money. So that's the hardest step, is they can't get the initial seeding money. That's why you've got IBA. And then they say, but when they do get up and running, when they want to kind of scale up their business, they find it extremely difficult to attract additional kind of capital to be able to do that. And they say the main reason for that is because banks and other institutions won't see Aboriginal people as too high risk. Notwithstanding, of course, that the general figure in the census data is about 80% of small businesses fail on the first go, both white and all black. So it doesn't make any difference. But there's somehow this ongoing peculiarity in relation to Aboriginal people trying to access finance. I think the other thing too, in relation to these businesses and jobs, is that what we don't really appreciate, and the data shows that the nature of the multiplier effect, because Aboriginal businesses are usually going to employ family or extended family, and they're also going to employ friends or people they know very well. So the multiplier effect of developing Aboriginal businesses adds significantly to the nature of the benefit and well-being of local communities.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's certainly one of the things that's been really apparent to me as I've gone around and spoken to a couple of Aboriginal businesses, the social impact piece that they have, even though they're kind of, for the most part, they're kind of businesses to make profit, right? Like lots of non-Aboriginal businesses, like that's their prerogative to have a profit-making business. But then the broader impact on the community and the expectation put on them. We heard a bit of this from Supply Nation, talking about how Aboriginal businesses are almost expected to employ Aboriginal people. They're expected to do a whole bunch of kind of social impact stuff. I mean, I think they're doing that off their own bat anyway, but there's an increased expectation from the non-Indigenous community that do that over the profits of their business. I do digress because I want to ask about something else, which is the Indigenous Chambers of Commerce. They're around the country, really, and we've heard from a few of them and some of the really important work that they're doing to support Aboriginal businesses, from the kind of, you kind of mentioned some of the startup stages through to kind of financial literacy and capacity. They're doing some of that kind of grassroots work now. Do you think that there's an increased role for them in how we better support Aboriginal businesses?
I think the genesis of the Chamber of Commerce tonight, I think it's been absolutely tremendous in the sense that it's organically grown out of the leadership and initiative of those senior people in those respective communities, and I believe there's a number of them growing right around the country, which I think is absolutely fantastic, because it obviously will offer confidence and support to businesses, but I think also their ability to engage with other businesses externally and industries, and to present an Aboriginal view about this, because I do think in my initial comments, I talked about the fact that this is not an assimilationist process. Its success is currently and will continue to be, and I'm sure the Chamber of Commerce, recognising that while businesses need to be competitive in the mainstream in their own right, there is that very strong Aboriginal connection and definition and representation of identity that comes through that makes it unique. So I think that there's a significant value proposition that the Chamber of Commerce is actually bring to leveraging, both ways, of course, to providing the support necessary to their membership, but also showing great leadership in establishing the nature of Aboriginal businesses standing within the broader economy and the broader business and community environment.
And so, you talked about kind of people not knowing where to go to be able to access support or to be able to do bits and pieces. Sounds like from some of the evidence we've heard, Indigenous Chambers of Commerce are doing some of that work. But it sounds like from your early evidence too that needs to be kind of ramped up so people know where they can go to be able to scale up their business or do the startup stuff and access the mainstream services that are available to all small businesses, not just Aboriginal businesses. Yeah,
that's right. But what we have missing, there's two in my personal view, there's two levels of architecture we have missing in relation to building on this, because one is not all PBCs are going to be funded.
Yeah.
I suspect politically the government's not going to fund every PBC, but there needs to be some kind of a hub and spokes approach towards having a central agency capable of providing the back of room and front of room services to the PBCs, being able to develop the business case and business plans, and I guess showing him the pathways to opening doors for finance and capital, I think there's that requirement. And I think at the higher end of the level, I do think that we need to consolidate an investment and infrastructure entity approach towards channeling the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander investment funds that come from government. Now, whether that be a carve-off from particular SIVs or whether it be some identification of additional capital that are able to invest for the long term so they can be a secure capacity to draw down from that, independent of government programs. I think that, but also looks at building capability where there are existing trust funds in Aboriginal corporations, a provision of a kind of investment or financial management services that are able there to build on those investments, but also to provide advice as to how Aboriginal people's own investments can be used to leverage additional private capital, working in partnership in developing investment in housing and other infrastructure and services in communities. I think that governments haven't been able to deliver that. The housing situation is a classic example. There's no reason why governments shouldn't be looking at in the housing fund as to how they might leverage developing various products that are, notwithstanding this whole issue. I understand people talk about the complications of land tenure, and I just think personally it's a bit of an excuse not to do anything differently. Yes, there will be some legal challenges that will need to be addressed at some later date, but I do think that at the moment what we're failing to do is to think more creatively at what these housing products might look like in larger rural and remote Aboriginal communities. I think that it's just really been a bit of a lazy thinking and a lack of approach to this. And I think, you know, since the government finished off with its Commonwealth state housing agreements about 15 or 20 years ago, very little has been achieved because most of it's Commonwealth money. You know, you talk about the Commonwealth putting in $4 billion in the Northern Territory for housing. It probably is not going to hit. You know, it's not going to touch the ground in a lot of ways because, you know, the Productivity Commission historically has said that, you know, for every dollar that is invested in Aboriginal programs, probably less than 30 cents in that dollar hits the ground in real outcomes. I did ask Ken Henry, the previous Secretary of Treasury, a couple of years ago, I said, was that true or not? And he said, from a qualitative point of view, it's probably less than that. So most of the money that's being invested, this is what I talk about, the kind of systemic nature of the obstacles within the delivery mechanism. It's the nature of the Federation. Those monies leave here, go to the state treasury and budgetary processes and then get distributed to agencies. So less than 30 cents hits the ground on projects, and yet it's Aboriginal people who get blamed for the nature of what is seen as a lack of change or advancement. But most of those monies, if you go up to Northern Australia, why aren't all the public servant positions, or majority of them, on a pro rata basis filled by Aboriginal people who are very capable and competent of filling those jobs? I know, I was an example. I was the first Aboriginal welfare officer in Wyndham, I ran the size of Victoria for 2 years. But I started my job as a welfare aide. And so at that stage, in my time, it aid for everything: welfare aid, health aid, teachers aid, police aid, you name them, they had an aid for it. But they wouldn't give us the jobs, but we were the ones capable. It's only because my boss got sick of me asking him why I wasn't in charge of the office, because I provided the continuity for graduate officers coming out of university, fresh out of university, taking high-paid jobs in the bush, but not knowing the community. So what are the, you know, this is not a criticism of public servants, but it's the reality of our system. Most of them are paying off their first, if not second or third house down south. Most of them drive around in government motor cars they don't pay the fuel for. They get heavily subsidised rent in government houses, get air conditioning allowances, get paid a camping allowance every time they get in their motor cars and drive bush to an Aboriginal community, can go to a training course down south just about every month, or if not even more. It's all paid on it comes out of taxpayers' money. So the money doesn't stay in the local economy, it actually goes down south. So why can't we've got about 1,000 rangers across Northern Australia, if not more. Why couldn't the majority of them take over the jobs, retiring public servants in fisheries, in agriculture, in border security? They're very capable people of living on their country, doing this stuff. They're not recognised for their skills. So there's this strong systemic issues that control. I remember back in 1989, I was on the Aboriginal Development Commission board prior to the creation of ATSIC. But, and I don't mind saying this, but we were negotiating with the Public Service Union, and one of the propositions we put forward was that there be key performance indicators for regional managers in relation to outcomes. It's a bit like what you've got Closing the Gap now, but there were actually formal KPIs of people's contracts. And they told us it'd go on a national strike if we put that position forward. So there's this kind of, attitude. I'm not, as I say, I'm not being critical of public servants themselves who are doing there, but answer the question, why does everything have to be seen within law and order? It comes back to Aboriginal people at the end of the day, with the relationship with police. Where's the health or the welfare, or what are they doing in their jobs before it comes to a kind of illegal sort of situation? So talk about the economy and economic situation. Those things, the structural and fundamental things in the relationship has to change too. Yep. Sorry, I've gone a bit offline, but you got me going.
No, I think it kind of, we know there are kind of multiple levels of kind of engagement that need to happen to get progress. I don't think anybody would be surprised to hear that. In terms of the economic work is one piece of it, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, that is all we have time for today. Professor, I want to say thank you very much for your attendance here today. I don't think you've been, I think I asked you to provide some information on notice, but if you want to provide any additional information, you have until the 14th of October to do that and provide it to the Secretariat. You might get some additional questions on notice from committee members as well. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request any corrections to transcription errors. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I now welcome, thank you, Professor.
Thanks,
I
Peter.
now welcome representatives from the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thank you, Senator. I'm Joe Morrison. I'm the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. To assist, I don't need you to say your name because you're on screen with us, but I now invite you to make a brief opening statement of hopefully no more than 2 minutes, because I know there's a bunch of people who want to ask you some questions.
Thank you, Senator. Firstly, I'll just open by a bit of historical context about the corporation. It was established in 1995 following the High Court judgment in Mabo with the particular purpose of acquiring property and assisting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with that acquisition, but also the management of those properties So we are quickly arriving at our 30-year anniversary. We have some lessons that we'd like to share today with the committee, in particular the launch of our national strategy that we launched last year and the lessons that we've learnt, but also the voices that we've heard through community consultation. So I'll leave it at that as opening remarks. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, and I'll hand the call to Senator Ghosh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here today. Can I ask, you just referred to that strategy and from 2023 to 2028 or 38. What were the main aspects of the feedback you received from First Nations people about the barriers to achieving economic self-determination, and what are the major opportunities that they identified?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Firstly, I'll just contextualise the feedback that we did receive. It wasn't purely about the economic circumstances of First Nations people. It was obviously a response to our core mandate, but which is the acquisition of property rights. As I said earlier, the ILC was established for that purpose, but in 2019 we had our legislation change, and that allowed the ILC to acquire property rights in water, that is freshwater rights, but also in marine rights as well. And so turning to the question of economics, obviously there's a number of things that people told us about what they thought about our strategy. It was the first time that the ILC's done such a comprehensive consultation process as part of its strategy. It is required to consider the interest of Indigenous Australians in the development of its strategy, but it's the first time that it actively went out, and particularly in the circumstances of being post-COVID, people did attend in that context, and we did probably get a lower number of attendees to our consultations because obviously people were still concerned about COVID. But turning to the question of economics, it was pretty wide-ranging. Obviously, the underlying theme about everything that the ILC does is about self-determination of First Nations people. And then they took their ideas through a number of things that intersect with this committee's inquiry, and I'll just run through those. So firstly, funding reform was a matter that was spoken about. That is the ability for the ILC in this context to be flexible and responsive to First Nations needs in relation to our mandate, and to continue to meet the expectations of First Nations. What I didn't say earlier about our corporation was it was established with a fund alongside it called originally the Indigenous Land Fund. That was in 2019, with the change in legislation, also shifted to be managed by the Future Fund Board of Guardians. That fund now sits at $2.3 billion, and that funds our core operations. Our drawdown, which I think has been mentioned this morning, is set in legislation at 2010 CPI values, and so effectively that has meant that our ability to acquire property hasn't kept up with market growth in properties as well. So that's one of the challenges. So obviously people have talked about funding reforms and the ability to be obviously open and transparent, but also to be able to be flexible and timely in relation to supporting First Nations groups. We also heard a little bit about reforms of the Native Title Act, in particular the ability to have some form of fungibility criteria for native title lands. And this is not a new conversation that we've heard, but we've certainly heard in the vast majority of native title determinations, particularly where there's coexisting rights, that is, it's not exclusive possession, but non-exclusive possession. People spoke a lot about the ability to have fungible title so they can get involved in economic development in those forms of determinations. We also heard about the need around broader economic participation, and I think Professor Yu just touched on there in Northern Australia, if I could use that example, where a lot of effort has gone into attracting investment. Very little of that investment has gone towards the ability for First Nations to drive that investment. So the typical approaches to attract foreign investment. And in places such as Northern Australia and many other parts of the country, where there's a lot of Indigenous people living in reserves on stations, for example, there's very little ability for them to be able to be drivers of those economic development opportunities. So I'll just leave it there in terms of those key things that we've heard, particularly pertaining to economic participation. But we do hear quite a lot when we are assessing our projects that First Nations people really want to be involved in leading the development, not to be passive participants in those activities, but also to be ensuring that the benefits are in accordance with their decision-making processes as well.
Thank you. Are you able to share any examples or case studies of where the ILSC has partnered with traditional owners or native title holders to leverage and grow their economic assets? And if it's possible, in terms of offshore or sea assets as well?
Yes, we can. We do publish an annual document that speaks to that, so we're happy to share the previous 2 years of that. I don't think we're quite right, quite at the point of publishing the most current version, but we can certainly share those with the committee.
Thank you. You mentioned funding reform and fungibility of assets or of title. What do you see as potentially the other major barriers to traditional owners realising or being able to leverage their economic assets, and particularly their native title assets?
Yeah, one thing I didn't touch on, Senator, is what the work that we have been doing, particularly around sector leadership. So we've heard from First Nations about particular sectors, and if I could just run those off. So we've heard a lot from First Nations around the country about renewables and clean energy. We've heard a lot about water-related rights and interest and achieving some outcomes in relation to water, fishing and aquaculture as well, and we can share some examples there. Carbon, which we've been involved in for some time, and new and emerging environmental markets. So they're sort of some of the areas where we've heard from the community that there needs to be Indigenous leadership into those sector developments. But there's also a number of existing sectors, such as agriculture, for example, where people have been participating in, but there isn't at the moment a national unified position when it comes to Indigenous involvement in some of the farming activities around the country as well. So there's obviously a desire for First Nations to get involved in a greater way in some of these existing sectors, but there's also an eye to some of these new and emerging sectors as well.
Last question, Senator Ghosh.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the role that the Commonwealth Government can play in order to assist prescribed body corporates or traditional owner representative institutions to achieve their economic potential or to be economically more successful, what do you see as potentially what the government should prioritise in that regard?
It's a very good question. It's a very difficult one to answer, I believe. But there are, and I believe Professor Yu did touch on it. There are a vast number of PBCs, for example, that have been established around the country, and probably only a small percentage, which I don't have the actual percentage at the top of my head, but there's only a small percentage of the total that are in a place to be actively involved in economic development in the current structure of native title, that is under the Future Acts regime. To be able to respond to third parties is one thing, but secondly, to be able to determine an Indigenous-led vision and future for that determined area is another thing. So I think there's been continued calls, particularly by the National Native Title Council and others, PBCs themselves, for investment in that, shifting from being claimants, native title claimants, to native title holders, to all of a sudden embarking on negotiating economic development outcomes is quite taxing for a number of groups. And I guess at the end of the day, as Peter was talking about, that there's a significant human capability gap in many places as well. So there's a need to be able to ensure that prescribed body corporates can obviously do the work that's required under the Native Title Act, but being involved in negotiations, particularly with third parties that are quite large and skilled at negotiations, is quite taxing on a lot of PBCs who aren't well placed or have their governance in place to be able to respond to those things.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ghost. Ms Chaney.
Sorry about that. Takes a while, doesn't it? Thank you. I'd love to hear more about the ability to be flexible and responsive, and just what that might look like.
Yes, good question. I think from our point of view, I mean, because our statutory mandate is pretty well straightforward, and as we've pivoted out of what the strategy used to say into something that's firmly been informed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we've certainly learned, and we're continuing to learn the lesson of being nimble in our assessment processes. We're also asked quite often to be, the partners of choice and to be advocates on behalf of some of our proponents to be able to attract other investments, whether they're from private, corporate or government. And we do have a reasonably strong network of partners that are interested in working with First Nations groups. So that's a benefit that we bring to negotiations. But I think our ability to ensure that our funding is in alignment with our strategy now. Obviously, we're not a big funder in terms of the quantum of monies that other departments and other agencies provide to First Nations, and we are pretty well straightforward. I think that allows us the level of flexibility to be able to respond to things as First Nation groups and Aboriginal corporations are requiring us to in a more timely manner. But obviously, that doesn't mean that everything that we do is going to meet the expectations of First Nations people.
And so, sorry, is it more flexible and responsive in terms of changing the mandate, or in order to be consistent with the mandate?
I guess when I say that, it's being, able to deal with the levels of risk that some corporations may bring to particular projects. For example, so if there's a project that would historically have seen to be quite risky, that could have, not been supported to the extent, whereas I think our risk appetite in the corporation now is a lot more mature, and we understand the particular challenges that First Nations groups, because obviously we don't wait for many groups to just rock up with a submission. We work hand in glove with a lot of corporations leading into the actual formal submission for support. So we assist them with business development and other sorts of development before we actually make a decision about funding. So it's a longer term partnership arrangement to understand what their expectations are.
And so are there limitations in the flexibility of the approval processes, so you're needing to be more nimble? Are there limitations in either your investment mandate or the risk appetite that's dictated, or the processes that need to change in order to be more flexible and responsive? What are the changes that actually need to happen? Is it operational or is it structural?
Well, one would say it's a bit of both. I think firstly our ability to fund is only with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander corporations, and so that's the first hurdle. If people aren't a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander corporation as required under our legislation, then we can't fund it. And as we know, many Indigenous people have got non-ATSI corporations working on their land, so that's something that we've heard is somewhat problematic and may be considered as part of any future legislative changes by the Parliament. That's one of those matters that we hear quite regularly about. And I think the other thing that is currently challenging us is just our ability to receive a drawdown out of our account as well. So that's quite limiting. Sometimes ATSI corporations need a project to be up and running, particularly if they're looking at negotiating the purchase of a property in a short period of time. And if we don't have that in our system, then it's obviously problematic for us to be able to turn that around in a timely manner. So there are circumstances in which that has been a challenge. We also have a standard deed.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to clarify on that, and is that timing dictated by legislation or regulation? So would it be, for example, to solve that problem, would it be a matter of changing legislation or regulation to say the drawdown can happen any time in the year, or is that the sort of change that's needed to fix that problem?
There is a discussion taking place, Senator, which is really around the changes in the legislation to allow for an increase in the drawdown. As I said earlier, it's based on a 2010 CPI equivalent value, and the market has obviously outstripped that. So that's something that we've just only recently opened up a conversation with Treasury and the Department of Finance about. And so that's one of those pressing questions that we have, is just our ability, with the growing appetite and number of Aboriginal corporations now in existence. Our demand book has grown quite considerably. So that's what I was alluding to there.
And are the assessment processes dictated in legislation or regulation as well, or is that an operational issue?
It's operational.
Yeah, okay. So some of the funding reform that's needed is in legislation, and you're in discussions with Treasury about that, and some is operational and you review those internally?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. Sorry, I did interrupt you before, Mr. Morrison. Did you lose that train of thought?
No,
Sorry.
I didn't lose it. I was getting to the point that we do have a legal document that we refer to as a deed of grant. So when property is acquired and it's transferred to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander corporation, typically what's happened is that there's a caveat placed on that property, which means that if there's, for example, a ATSI corporation that finds itself into difficult circumstances, which happens, that property cannot be lost to non-Indigenous hands, I guess is one way to put it. And so we have a trigger in the caveat when it comes time for that. If that scenario unfolds, someone does a title search, and if they're trying to recoup funds, then that triggers the ILC's legal interest in that property. And that's something that can be seen through the lens of being beneficial, but it's also something that I think many groups find it as being quite paternalistic as well.
And so, and you've said, there are two perspectives on that. From your consultation, was there a desire to change that? I mean, I understand the reason why that would be in place. Is it holding back economic development?
Well, some people will argue that, and we didn't really get strong responses from the consultations about that particular matter. That is something that we have different conversations with particular groups about. But one thing we have done in that process is to tighten up our turnaround timeframes to be able to lift those caveats or consents for people to get loans, for example. So if someone's talking to the IBA about getting a loan and they needed that caveat lifted, then we've got a more streamlined process to be able to do that and work alongside IBA for that.
And if they want to sell that property, what's the process? What's the alternative to lifting the caveat?
Yes, that's a good question. We haven't really got to that point yet, I must admit, and that's it's something that we're going to have to turn our minds to in the future. I know that the
ILC... It's never happened.
Sorry?
Has it never happened?
The ILC has sold properties, but the question of whether ATSI corporations have sold it, I can take that on notice and come back to the committee.
Yeah, okay. No, I don't know how relevant it is. I'm just trying to understand the process
Final question, Ms Chaney, if it's a short one.
I'll leave it there. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Chaney. Senator Little.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr Morrison. I just wanted to ask a question about at what point we know that a third of Indigenous businesses don't even engage with the government systems that are set up to support them. They've been quite successful without having to do that. Can you tell me at what point, given your experience not just at the ILC and previous to this at the Northern Land Council, at what point is it appropriate that government gets out of people's lives and lets them progress? And can we do more or less of that?
I'm not sure I could answer that, to be honest, Senator. I mean, we hear about those things, and I've certainly heard that all my life, working life, but I couldn't put a time frame on, when is an opportune time or not. I think from my point of view in the ILSC, I think at transaction level, what we don't do anymore is we don't acquire property and then it sits in our books. So in the same transaction as us acquiring the property, it's transferred directly to the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Corporation. So effectively, it's not on our books and it's out of our hands. And so it's effectively immediately. And I think that's become a pretty successful model. I can't speak for any other organisations on what their views might be about that particular question.
So I want to ask you about a proposition that funds, whether it be, in this context, it was about native title land, but whether it's native title land that or it's freehold title that's been purchased by the ILSC and has been then divested to the relevant Indigenous peoples. Can I ask you, at what point, what do you think about the proposition that monies that have been sought or economic opportunities being sought from people's land some of it be partitioned off into a common investment fund to benefit all Indigenous peoples? What sort of reaction do you think that would elicit from the diversity of Aboriginal groups, given the basis of native title is really to secure rights and benefits because something is impacted on your country, recognising, though, the importance of songlines?
So I'm not sure I'm capturing your question all that well, Senator. But
what do you think about the proposition of essentially a future fund from any land that's been put back into the hands of Aboriginal people, and where there are business benefits that derive from that?
I think there's already examples of where there's communally held property and it's going into a fund that's, obviously the outcome of some of the negotiations around third parties in the West, obviously, and other parts of the country. I think the nature of those funds and the level of transparency is probably a question of greater clarification for many of those individuals in that group. And if I'm reading your question appropriately, I think if it's a fund that was established for the purposes of that determined area, then obviously the benefits and the sharing arrangements of those benefits would have to be at the behest of that group.
But for much more broader, you would see that would require significantly more consultation, and there could be some resistance to that.
I would imagine so, Senator.
Thank you. Now, I just want to go to the issue of governance. You touched on transparency. Can we talk a little bit about the number of property projects and programs that exist on land that the ILSC has been associated with, where governance failure has led to administrative issues that have resulted in either the ILC stepping in or administration? Do you have a an idea about the numbers?
I don't on hand, but we can provide that.
If you can. And if you could also provide the numbers, if that is at all possible, what happens post-divestment? Do you track at all the sustainability of these entities post-relinquishing and divestment?
I'd have to be honest, Senator, and say that the ILC hasn't been all that successful in that last part of that question, and that's something that we do have a major project internally looking at doing a lot better, particularly in relation to properties that we hold, how we stay in touch with those corporations, how we ensure that they're meeting the expectations of the grant of land to them, but also the broader community benefits that they are achieving as well. So that's something that the ILC historically hasn't done all that well, but it is something that we're turning our mind to at the moment.
Okay. So what about, do you know of any examples that you can recall where people that have had land divested to them end up in a situation where it's difficult to work out how they actually pay for any of the infrastructure that's required to maintain those properties, even at a basic level, because that historically has been an issue where people just can't even afford to do basic maintenance on their properties that have been purchased.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well documented, Senator, that there was a lot of people dissatisfied with the previous approaches and policy of the then ILC to acquire property and then divest them back to traditional owner groups with no assets or not enough by way of investment to be able to hand that back in a state that was useful for them. And that's obviously something that we don't do these days. Obviously, as I said earlier, that what we typically do now is acquire and divest in the same transaction, and that means that many of the properties are required, but there's also a grant of monies for infrastructure and other assets they require as part of that grant. But a lot of these negotiations that we have are led by those First Nation groups in the first instance.
Can I just go to some of the comments you made earlier about carbon and more recent industries? In the early days, I think it would be fair to say that the focus of the ILC was the pastoral industry, captured by the romanticism and people's wanting to participate in an industry that they could connect to immediately. But there's been significant successes outside of that industry. You mentioned agriculture, tourism. So what are some of the risks that you see in these are existing industries that probably, I think it would be difficult to not argue that there is still plenty of opportunity in those existing industries of which people participate right now, as opposed to moving towards a new industry, a new idea, and contributing in those areas. How do you manage the expectations of the government in terms of their policy and their positioning versus improving what is already there?
I guess that's probably twofold, if I could. So firstly, the days where the ILC had a large pastoral holding and it was a subsidiary that had various names associated with those holdings. The ILC does not now have that subsidiary, which was for primary partners. That's now in the hands of Yaru people, in fact, that are operating Roebuck Station and the Roebuck Export Depot. We do have a number of pastoral stations in Cape York, and we've also got the Goombalanya Meats and station at Owen Pelly that aren't part of those, the portfolio of agribusinesses. But what we have seen more generally across a lot of those areas that there's now a level of flexibility, for example, in land tenure arrangements. So if I could point to Western Australia, where the ability for people to operate traditional pastoral operations and could also embark upon carbon farming using the savanna burning methodology, and particularly in the Kimberley, that has allowed people to diversify their operations, and that's something that obviously is dependent on state-based legislative changes, but that's something that's obviously not just a challenge for Aboriginal people, but also for non-Aboriginal people operating in challenging economic circumstances. And so that's an example where, we have, in that circumstance in Western Australia, worked with the West Australian government around those legislative changes and that new policy proposal that they have to change land tenure from purely pastoral to more diverse forms of use. That's certainly something that's proving pretty popular in parts of the Kimberley. And so, it is hoped that other jurisdictions can take a like approach and change that for the benefit of not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but the broader community.
Thanks, Senator Little. One final question, if it's short, please.
Thank you. Can you make a comment about this obsession with numbers and compliance with a norm? We know that Supply Nation, the eventual number of Indigenous procurement is 3%. We know that the Indigenous business definition is a bit flexible, but it's 51%, not recognising some joint venture capital raising innovative ideas that might exist. Can you just make a comment about the importance of opening up opportunities for the flexibility in how people actually get into business or grow their business under how the government defines a business should look like?
I'd have to take that on notice if you don't mind, Senator, and come back to you on that. I mean, that's quite a large question, and it requires some data, I think, to go with it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Little. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Morrison, for your time today. I wanted to talk a little bit about this sort of shortage of capital and an opportunity to develop Indigenous owned land. And when we had Professor Yu with us previously, we talked about the 7 million hectares of pastoral land, I think, in Western Australia alone, and the ability to attract capital. And noting that Professor Yu is currently doing a review of NAIF, the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund. Would have liked to have asked him, but I thought that was a little bit unfair to talk to him about that. But I know it's a different department, but I know that you're keenly interested in how we develop native title land. So I'm interested in your views about whether there's an opportunity for government to consider adapting NAIF in such a way that there would be a greater appetite for risk, when it comes to, let's say, that 7 million hectares of pastoral land in Western Australia.
Yeah, I can answer that, but I'll probably, not use the NAIF example if I could speak more broadly, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So, I mean, my experience, particularly in Northern Australia, which is obviously a challenged environment. There's obviously a skills issue in Northern Australia versus the majority of the North being owned by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in some shape or form, whether it's inalienable freehold or coexisting rights. And I think part of the challenge for Indigenous people's participation in that part of Australia is really the ability to underwrite the nature of the risk. That is, if you're wanting to attract investment and you need to partner with a First Nations group, the First Nations group typically doesn't have the capital to involve themselves in that. So that having the capital is one thing, but also having the level of risk secured, which doesn't alienate land tenure, I think, is one of the structural challenges that not only NAIF but many others have faced in Northern Australia. So I think that was part of the nervousness in my experience with some of the banks being involved in this as well, and the myth of fungibility, particularly in remote communities, is one of those challenges that traditional financial institutions face when it comes to dealing with Indigenous economic development.
And I might just talk a little about sort of the capability gap, and we're always, talking about supporting Indigenous people to get business skills, to get governance skills. You're in the business of investing in Indigenous projects. What are you looking for when it comes to the capability of the applicants?
Well, I guess what we look for is a stable and sustainable governance arrangement, and obviously some proof that a corporation, for example, has been operating in a sustainable way and they've got stable governance arrangements in place to be able to take on a particular business proposition. I'd say that they're pretty well, clear. We also want to make sure that we're investing in acquisitions of land that are in alignment with native title interests. There's nothing in our legislation to say that we have to divest to traditional owners of that particular area. Obviously, we have to take that into consideration, and so that's another area of interest that could probably be considered in the future. I'd say those kinds of matters are, something that the ILC has turned its mind to in recent years.
And are you aware of and do you promote certain programs to help with that sort of upskilling?
Well, we have one program, and it's called Our Country, Our Future, and that's the program that we use for the acquisition and the management functions of the corporation. And so we have an internal assessment process that assesses that. But as I said earlier, there is a lead-in time where our officers work alongside particular corporations to understand those corporations, to bring other capital to a particular project, and it ranges from a ranger base in the middle of the Kimberley or middle of Australia to a dialysis unit in Coober Pedy, for example, or contributing to a health centre in New South Wales or Alice Springs. So it's quite diverse, and I think people have told us through our consultations that they want to be partners with the ILC rather than just be recipients of funding.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Morrison. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Price. Through the period of the inquiry, we've heard of quite a number of emerging industries, in particular native foods and botanicals, and there's been talk about the kind of big kind of opportunities, economic opportunities that are there for First Nations people. Do you have a sense of kind of what the other emerging industries are, and kind of what's your role in supporting people, Aboriginal businesses, Aboriginal communities to get into those spaces?
Yeah, if I could turn my mind to, obviously the one that's on everyone's mind that I'm sort of talking to at the moment is around the nature repair market. That's certainly something that's growing. I know it's before Parliament at the moment, but the development of the nature repair market is in the same way that the carbon market was developed. There's obviously lots of lessons for First Nations people there. The other example is the clean energy market as well. Now, obviously, there's a capital deficit in these areas, and so one of the things that we are doing is to align particular groups with other investors and other supporters.
Okay.
Obviously, we can't provide financial advice when it comes to these things. We don't hold the FSL for that, but that is something that we do, and we can also assist with the development of business plans with various corporations if they want to embark upon particular projects or business ventures.
Yeah, sorry. And so you can't provide the financial advice, but you can link them up to the right people to do that for them?
Well, we can certainly advise them they need to get that. We're very, I think that sort of advice is particularly important and legalistic. We certainly don't want to steer people in the wrong direction, but it's certainly that's something that people need to be aware of, is to get appropriate financial advice around structuring their finances, but also structuring deals and so forth.
Yeah, and one last question from me. What are the immediate priorities for the Commonwealth Government to support kind of our mob's economic growth and caring for country? And like you kind of talked about the nature repair market. Maybe that's kind of one of the places. But yeah, I'm keen to get your thoughts on, what are those priority areas?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the Commonwealth, but I can speak for what we heard in our consultations that informs our particular strategy.
Yeah.
That really is, and our work alongside Professor Yu's alliance as well around the economic empowerment agenda are in alignment that Indigenous people really want us to be working alongside them, working with them. We certainly see some opportunities, like you mentioned, the native foods and botanicals. That's something that we've obviously been investing in for some time to convene groups to look at that and to particular topics such as the Kakadu Plum Alliance. So we've invested in that. But I think there's a significant gap, and particularly with the work that Professor Yu has led around structural reform across a number of areas where if we shift away from Indigenous economic development, not shift it away, but do it as well as those approaches which some people would class as trickle-down economics, where Indigenous people are involved in deals that provide jobs and other benefits, to a process that is more about equity. I think that's obviously a gap across the country and the Commonwealth policy settings, for example, and there isn't the capital base for that to occur at this point in time. The ILC has a fund, as I alluded to. It's a pretty small fund when it comes to these conversations, and so there needs to be, I think, a considered discussion about how do we leverage Indigenous and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into Australia's economic fabric going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there's definitely more questions that I could ask, but we are out of time. So I do want to say thank you for your attendance here today. I think you've agreed to provide some additional information on notice that is due to the Secretariat by the 14th of October. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison.
Thank you, Senator.
Right. Oh, great. I can see our next witnesses are online. I now welcome the Northern Territory Indigenous Business Network representative to give evidence today. For the Hansard Wegger, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee today?
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm trying to make my video work. It's not working. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Sorry about that, Senator. My name is Naomi Anstes. I am the big boss at the Northern Territory Indigenous Business Network, and I'm joined today by Deborah S.S. Vallejo, who is the General Manager of the network.
So that was Deborah
Anstes Vallejo.
Anstes Vallejo. Excellent. All right. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement of hopefully no longer than 2 minutes so we can get to some questions for you. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'm really grateful to be here today on behalf of the Northern Territory Indigenous Business Network, which is a 100% Aboriginal-owned grassroots entity. We're an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation owned by Aboriginal business owners. We certify Aboriginal businesses in the Northern Territory, have been around for about 15 years. We are delivering by contract the Northern Territory Indigenous Business and Employment Hub for the Commonwealth Government. We are the only Aboriginal-owned entity delivering that work across the Territory. We are exceeding our KPIs and we are growing business capability and black business capability unapologetically in the North.
Excellent. Lovely and succinct. I will go to Senator Ghosh for questions.
Thank you, Chair. In your interactions with your members and in the feedback you get, what are the major barriers that your members face in terms of growing and sustaining their businesses? And do your members receive any Commonwealth Government assistance in relation to overcoming those barriers?
So the first part of that question, and thank you for that question, it's very critical right now. For our businesses, it's access to capital for startup. Obviously, we are dirt rich and money poor, and we can't mortgage our land in the Northern Territory. So ultimately, with generations upon generations of no wealth and abject poverty, fourth world conditions, there's no ability for us to raise the capital to start our businesses. And while the carrot by the Commonwealth Government's Indigenous procurement policies 50-50, 51-49 created an opportunity for non-Indigenous entities to invest that capital to start businesses, it's also created the unintended consequence of blackhatting. And so control is really where the cash is. Cash is king. And in the partnership arrangements where all the cash sits with the non-Indigenous JV holder, the threat is always there that can be withdrawn. In terms of the Commonwealth providing support, so that's the greatest challenge is access to capital. There are many other challenges, but you asked me what the greatest was. The second part to your question was Commonwealth support. So the Commonwealth provides a range of supports to Aboriginal businesses. The first way that we'll talk about is through the contracted Indigenous business hubs across the country. 3 existing hubs, the Woolwich Hub, the Circle and the Yapa Hub. So that's WA, South Australia and New South Wales were single select and all to non-Indigenous entities. We don't classify the New South Wales Land Council as an Indigenous entity because it's a statutory authority. And they were all single selected. Ours was the only one that went out to market and is owned by an Indigenous entity. We also have to deliver for the same amount of money 4 sites as opposed to 1, and we have to deliver to 600 clients as opposed to 200, which the others have in the most expensive neighbourhood in the country and the most geographically isolated. So it's a challenge, but we are meeting that challenge and certainly demonstrating we're achieving our KPIs. That's funded through the Commonwealth. Other things funded through the Commonwealth include the Aboriginal Benefits of Account that is now, that went to NTAC, that is now the Aboriginal Investment NT. We've had a lot of issues related to that entity. What's accessible, what's not accessible, what works for business, what doesn't work for business. Now a reiteration of that program to further disadvantage the for-profit sector of Aboriginal businesses. We represent non-Aboriginal, not-for-profit Aboriginal businesses and Aboriginal community-controlled orgs and PPCs, but we also represent the for-profit sector. And they've reduced the funding that's able to be sought, the only space for capital out of the ABA, to $100,000 for businesses in their first 2 years, or $150,000, which is chump change in relation to the macro industries, particularly across the north. To buy a machine to work in the resources sector, for example, you need $1 million, and they'll say you can use that 150 to leverage other capital, but the bank still won't lend you any money if you can't secure that, and you can't get it anywhere else. Where they are still putting money is into the Aboriginal community-controlled sector, which is great, except that now we're seeing, economic monopolies on country and still no outcome. They're not partnering with privately owned businesses, and we're not creating economic streams. And for vibrant economies on country, you need competition to push prices down. And where the ACCOs run everything, pricing is not competitive, and therefore our people are paying through the nose. But also we aren't getting the skills or the jobs because our ACCOs continue to see non-Indigenous CEOs running them. What else does the Commonwealth fund? A range of other grant programs and things through the mainstream business sector. We do a fair bit of work with DFAT and Austrade, who've been great partners to us. And the NTIBN has also been leading the work around the National Indigenous Business Chambers Alliance, which is pulling all of the grassroots, homegrown business chambers together to create the National Alliance, which should take over the position of the Commonwealth-funded Supply Nation, which exists to... So Supply Nation exists to support non-Indigenous entities meet their minimum mandatory requirements, and we exist for the growth of the Aboriginal business sector and economic development.
Thank you. I'd like to just unpack a couple of the things you mentioned in that that excellent answer. Thank you. The first is in relation to the joint venture process under the Indigenous Procurement Program. You alluded to, and we've heard lots of evidence around some of the issues in that program. What are the ways that you think that program can be best improved?
Well, I think, first of all, I will say to the Commonwealth, the Indigenous procurement policy was the single greatest policy that activated the Aboriginal business sector for the country. So I'm very proud of what the policy has done to help us to grow the space. What I will say is the unintended consequences that have followed demand a sophistication of that policy now. The requirement, so the Northern Territory Indigenous Business Network has never verified or recognised 50-50 ownership models, where 50% is Aboriginal owned and 50% is not Aboriginal owned. And that's on the basis that if you were 50% Aboriginal and 50% African, what kind of business are you? Are you an African business or are you an Aboriginal business? You can't really tell. And I don't know about you, but I went to school and did some basic mathematics. I do know what majority is. And so real control comes with that, and actually control under the law comes with that as well, as along with the shareholding agreements. So the first thing is to move to the majority ownership model that all of the states' premiers and chief ministers agreed to under Closing the Gap. So the Closing the Gap definition of an Aboriginal enterprise is 5149, but no one has moved to that despite signing up to that and it having been around for years. And I think that's really important to recognise. The only jurisdiction by government who has done that to date is the Northern Territory government. So that's a wonderful thing that our government has done and is running with. So that's the first thing, is the change to majority ownership. The second is to recognise what is black cladding and what is not, and who's using the process for the right purposes. So is skills transfer occurring? Are we seeing wealth generation in these entities? In the entities that are 5149, 51 owned by one or two Aboriginal people, and 49 being owned by an existing non-Indigenous entity that may be turning over $100 million, and I could list a couple of those. I will not today on Hansard. But where there's that power imbalance, what we've seen is people operating in the space of IPP for over 12 years, and the Indigenous entity that is stood up still subcontracting all of the work back to the non-Indigenous entity. So I call this black door contracting, winning the work through the Indigenous entity and subcontracting all the work back to the non-Indigenous entity, not providing the skills transfer to stand up that entity in its own right. They couldn't price the work, they couldn't deliver the work, they couldn't do their own accounting. In many of the cases, the Aboriginal owners can't even see the bank account. So at some point we need to say, if you have not demonstrated appropriate skills transfer, if you have not demonstrated that this business has now stood up to stand on its own and can self-perform some of these works, you can no longer access preferred procurement. I think we need to consider timeframes for people to be allowed to black door contract in that space and get rich off of black cladding. The other component to that is how the unintended consequence has locked Aboriginal businesses in. So one of the things becomes that because there's IPP, particularly in the territory government or others may say, you've got contracting capability under IPP and defence, you go there, that's where you belong, we'll lock you into IPP. They won't let us out into the mainstream to contract or aren't finding other ways for us to get in. And certainly across departments, we're not seeing the same balance. It's pretty much defence and doing all the heavy lifting. I think it's really critical for us to be looking at how this works across agencies, across governments, across jurisdictions, but also looking at how it's being applied to across how businesses are creating capital. So once you're turning over $100 million and you're still a 5149, should we still be allowing those people to contract into preferred procurement, or should they be making way for new entities coming through? So I think we need to be thinking about what is the cap of turnover, and I would say that cap is only applicable to 5149s and not applicable to 100% owned. That's my other recommendation, is that we need to move to preferencing 100% owned Aboriginal enterprises. That doesn't mean getting rid of 5149s. Majority-owned businesses are still very important, but I'm talking about preferencing.
No, understood. Thank you very much. That's been incredibly helpful.
Thank you, Senator Ghosh. Senator Little.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation today. I just wanted to ask, back in 2021, your organisation received $10 million over 4 years, I'm assuming to set up the hubs. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you've actually funded right now? Are you only funded by members, or is there another stream of funding that supports your ongoing work?
Yeah, so we have very little funding. We're working towards a self-funded, self-reliant model. We are funded that $10 million over 4 years. That came in under a competitive contract, so it's not a grant. It came in under a competitively tendered contract, so it's contractual. I think it's 3+2 actually, 3+2. And we've invested that money into our own model. So we have a membership model. Unlike Supply Nation, our members are the Aboriginal businesses. Supply Nation's members are the corporates, and I think that's important to recognise. And through our membership fees, we create a little bit of revenue. It's very minuscule. We proposed a fee-for-service model with the Commonwealth and with the Northern Territory Government, both who told us to get self-sufficient and then told us our contracts had to be free for service. So it is very difficult for us to become sustainable if we cannot create revenue through fee-for-service activity. So we've had to think really differently about how we do things. We've engaged in other contractual arrangements with primes. We've had funding through the land councils who've been partners of ours to stand up our hub in Alice Springs. We were funded to create a single hub in Darwin and satellite hubs in 3 other locations, but we couldn't do that to Central Australia. And Senator Little, I'm sure that you would appreciate Central Australia being critical to Aboriginal affairs and Aboriginal economic development in the Territory. We went the whole hog and said we will stand up a hub here, and we diverted costs to making sure we manned that hub appropriately and stood it up earlier, about a year earlier, with the help of the CLC and stimulus funding. We are engaging in procurement partnerships under a fee-for-service basis with prime entities across resources, construction, and defence in particular. Some we have smaller contracts with across the entertainment and hospitality industry, and we're engaging in a contract at the moment to provide education around procurement to Endeavour Group.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. I think you've explained to us you get out there and you're basically getting funding wherever you possibly can. Supply Nation clarified that only probably a third of Indigenous businesses that exist actually engage with Supply Nation or engage with any government funded entities to support Indigenous business development. I was particularly interested in the time I have to tease out some of your thoughts. You mentioned the differences between you and Supply Nation. I'm interested in teasing out, you talked about Indigenous owned, but I also want to talk about Indigenous prosperity in business. So, you're talking about Indigenous owned, but who supports the growth, development and opportunity for growth for those Indigenous businesses that aren't engaging with your organisation and who may not be 51% Indigenous owned, but certainly employ a large number of Indigenous people, as do most Indigenous businesses, and are interested in a focus on profit, but may not meet that threshold because of the way they've entered into business. So I'm interested in just having a conversation about that. Who does the Indigenous prosperity in business bit if you don't, and if Supply Nation doesn't?
Thank you, Senator. I'll say we absolutely do. This is the work we do through the hub and through our own programs that we've stood up. So we do a lot of the work around the growth, diversification, investment into business. We do a lot of support with our businesses to grow and do their planning and to do their recruitment and their strategies. We also provide them direct access to capital and capital partners and to jobs, as well as employment opportunities. We work with those who don't meet the 5149 threshold, and we keep it open for those, and we help those who are coming to us with an idea who are ready to get to that point of 5149. We've run a number of programs with the Northern Territory Government to transition those who are not at that threshold to that threshold. And we've supported anybody who's interested in growing their business, whatever level of partnership, into it. So they might not meet our certification requirements, but that doesn't mean we don't deliver the services. The services are critical for us to give everywhere. And we certainly work with a number of major entities with high Aboriginal employment around further opportunities for their growth and workforce development. We've got partnerships right now with Isaac NT on skills growth for those companies.
Right. We could talk for quite a while about the need to engage with capital, but I'm really interested in the other reason for some of the success in Indigenous businesses is actually that opportunity to have access to networks that they wouldn't otherwise have, whether that's finance, business, skills, whatever. Can you just talk me through a little bit about how critical the networking aspect is to help people to not only go into business, but to also get some frank advice when they think they've got a great idea that they shouldn't?
Absolutely, Senator, and thank you for that question. We would say it's the most critical component for Aboriginal businesses. You can't be what you can't see, but it's also you don't know what you don't know, and you can't grow if you don't know. We run networking events and opportunities more often than anything else. We run specialist sessions for women, Aboriginal women and young people in particular, to talk to each other around make a job, don't take a job, to share ideas on pricing, what does cultural intellectual property and monetising look like, and workshopping together just to celebrate new businesses as well. So the networking element is really critical because it also provides opportunities for them to meet the buyer with each other and more black-to-black contracting or Indigenous-to-Indigenous contracting, which I've seen grow significantly in the time that we've been running operationally here. I think the other component is we deliver trade fairs and black markets to do these as well. So the networking occurs outside of just the Indigenous business community. It occurs with the buyers as well and our allies in the market, which is really important. We run training and development sessions for people too, which also act as networking events, and we engage with the other industry areas. I think that our networks are the most critical, and that's why we're looking to bring all of the chambers together to create a national network for more of these opportunities at the national level. So that the networking can occur. It's so important for our people to be able to get together, share their stories, share their challenges, and not feel alone, because it is a very difficult space. It's challenging and it's fairly hostile in the industries, the major industry sectors.
Can I ask about how you actually connect up with those huge entities that are actually sitting and controlling a lot of the opportunity, things such as the NAIF and other Indigenous business entities? How do they engage with you at all to connect them well before? Because as you know, it takes a while to respond to an opportunity. I'm interested in when do they engage with you as well?
Yeah, so we've been engaging a fair bit with NAIF over the last 4 years in particular. We've held a number of information sessions around NAIF. We've been pushing NAIF to use us more around their auditing with their major projects around their Aboriginal engagement. We haven't got there, and we aren't winning in that battle at the moment, but we certainly engage in a partnership capacity with them. We also work with all of the other entities. We work with Defence NT. We work with ICN when we have to, the chambers, the mainstream chambers. We work with the primes. Like I said to you, we actively engage as procurement partners for them, and we're recognised by the Northern Territory Government as the peak. Just as a side note, I'd like to let you know that Supply Nation has about 160 members across the north, the far north, which includes Queensland and WA. We have 460 members. So we have a very active membership community that's recognising that the network is bringing value. So we know also that we hold for purpose networking events, and we count the number of contracts that come out of each event.
Thank you.
Final question, Senator Little, if you've got one.
No, I think. I just want to ask a quick question about the about women and women's participation in business. That's growing at enormous rates and has been for a few years across all business sectors. What are Aboriginal women telling you about wanting to enter into business? I'm more interested in business for profit than, say, somebody who's looking to make a little bit of money from their art and craft.
Women are saying, let us in, let us be heard, let us be seen, let us do it. They're definitely leading the way. We've got one business owner here, 100% owns a civil construction company, and in the last 5 years has grown it from a $200,000 business to a $50 million business employing 90 people, like 30 or 40 who are Indigenous full-time. She's invested in other Aboriginal businesses. She's working with young women to get them into the industry. Our women are telling us they can and they want to, and what they're telling us is they need some space and they need men to let them. Particularly in community, women are telling us that they need our men to create space for them and allow them to do the business and to be deciding things. And it can be very difficult through a cultural lens. But on the main, what they're saying is we need capital and we need extra supports.
Yeah, in demand for women in business at the moment is really that networking for Indigenous businesses and that one-on-one mentoring, having someone there to support them, which is what our hub model does. Yeah. And we've noticed that they just want that one person they can call and say, how am I going? What do I need next? So a lot of that one-on-one mentoring, coaching and networking is a really big in demand in terms of service delivery for our Indigenous business female owners. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Little. Deputy Chair, Ms Price.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Naomi. Love hearing the discussion around the opportunities for networking. As myself, as the member for Durack, I represent the Northwest, so I know that often between one business to another and from one organisation that wants to support a business, often there's thousands of kilometres in between. So my first question really goes to those people who are, whether they're male or female, Indigenous business owners, about those in very remote parts of the country. Are you able to support them?
Look, I think that's a really important question. Thank you, Senator. We've tried our best with the limited funding we have in our contract to support the largest possible landscape we can. So we placed our hubs up the highway, Darwin, Katherine, Tennant Creek, Alice Springs. We've done a little amount of remote outreach, and we certainly do online and over the phone. The difficulty is our budget to travel, and as you know, getting out to those places, our mob actually, don't have the infrastructure for online stuff all the time, and that's why there's a lot of work happening by the Commonwealth in the digital space, but also really need people to be there with them, workshopping ideas and how to get into it. So there needs to be more consistency around funding that would enable travel and getting specialist people into community to doing those workshops. But I would say that while we're supporting remote community at the moment, and we are doing a fair amount, way over and above our requirement, because we know how important it is very difficult to do that without the dollars.
Yeah, I expected that was going to be your answer, so thank you for that. Time is of the essence. So just a quick question around skills development and governance training. Obviously, for a business to succeed, they need an individual or a group of people that have got skills to run the business, and also, a governance training. Does your organisation provide that type of training?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, we do. And more recently, as a member of the Aboriginal Peak Organisations NT, which I think is a very important thing to note, as a business entity or economic development entity being part of the Peaks, we recently have won the right to take over the Aboriginal Governance and Management Program that was funded to APONT. And the reason we've done that is because it's been failing in our Aboriginal entities and community organisations, because it isn't looking hard enough at the split between Aboriginal cultural governance and corporate governance or business governance. So we're reviewing that program. We're in a process at the moment where we're reviewing that program and creating new resources to roll out next year a highly robust program and set of tools for remote communities, town, everywhere, around Aboriginal governance and management, which would include the corporate governance component. What we are tired of seeing is dumbed down versions of corporate governance for Aboriginal people, which the Commonwealth has funded previously. And going into those, when you've been into the mainstream ones, it's very disappointing to see how nyon or cute they are and not real they are for our people. But our people need to also understand that even in the not-for-profit, we have to be solvent.
Yeah. Well, I wish you all the best with that course. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ms Chaney.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to hear more about how you navigate the complexities of Indigenous land tenure to facilitate business opportunities with the businesses that you work with.
Thank you very much. As I said a little bit earlier, we've got really great relationships with the land councils. Northern Land Council and Central Land Council previously funded us to stand up our remote locations in Katherine and Tennant Creek earlier than our Commonwealth contract, which has been really fantastic. Katherine and Alice Springs, as well as part-time in Tennant Creek. I've just lost my train of thought. I'm having a good day today. I've got a bit of a cold. Land access and tenure. So one of the things that we've really struggled with, and we've heard from our businesses and our business owners, is that access to land for Aboriginal people is really difficult, even if it's their own land. So we've been working with Central Land Council around delivering training and information sessions around how to access Section 19, so that we can do that a bit quicker and understand much easier how that works. I've also been meeting with the Central Land Council, not so much with Northern Land Council recently, around how we will partner together so that the NTIBN and our Indigenous enterprise consultants can support people's applications for land tenure. I think there needs to be some real work around the Act, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, around what that looks like and feels like for Aboriginal traditional owners on their own lands to be able to unlock Section 19s. Because at the moment it's so difficult that your money's pretty much gone by the time the decision is made, whereas non-Aboriginal people can wait you out because they've got the cash to just sit there and wait, or the cash to buy the outcome. So ultimately, we've also got this issue around royalties versus equity and opportunity. So we're working with major projects owners, like the prime contractors of mines and owners of mines, to talk about how we provide not just free prior informed consent, but free prior informed consent and opportunity in the earlier stages. So I spoke at the Resources Week last week to those mining companies, and I'm working very closely with them at the moment to talk about how we give Aboriginal people more opportunities on their own land, and how they're thinking about what it looks like for profit share and real jobs and make a job as opposed to the royalty model, and how they could be the capital investors into enterprises on country and the builders of infrastructure. So not just talking about opportunities on the project itself, but how they're investing in economic growth on country for community and economic development. So how can they put the capital in instead of royalties, which seem to be hamstringing our people at the moment. I'm sorry if that doesn't quite answer the question. It's a difficult one because obviously the Act impacts our access, and the Land Council processes are complex, can be difficult, and allow a lot of people to decide for your country that aren't from your country.
And we know in the business space, sorry to jump in there, it really is about speed to market. If you've got an idea as a traditional owner, but you can't activate until you go through a Section 19 lease, which, process, which can take any time between, let's be real, 12 months to 5 years, it's a really big issue for us, for our businesses. So we are trying to work through what that looks like. Can we streamline that process in this case? It's
also about understanding, and I think also, our Aboriginal people understanding the process as well. So I think in some cases they're not understanding the process that you have to go through, and we see that even with the ABA or NTAC or Aboriginal Investment NT, who rejected a number of our freehold landowners because they didn't have a Section 19, didn't need one, it's their land, but rejected their bids. So, it's very clear that even our funding entities don't understand the complexities of land tenure. And so what we're trying to do at the moment is really educate and provide the information sessions to people so that we can understand the requirement and then support our businesses to complete the requirements to get
and be ready. Yeah.
So poor understanding even within the regulators, plus slow processing times is a problem. In terms of the land tenure laws themselves, what sort of changes would unlock business opportunities for the members that you have?
I wouldn't like to speculate on that one. I'd probably get into a lot of trouble. What I will say is, as Deb said, the speed to market piece is really critical, and particularly unlocking the process for traditional owners on their own country, making that piece faster. I think whatever we could do to cut out steps for that piece, I think is the most critical. I don't know that it would need to go to full council for a single owner, for a traditional owner on their own country to be able to get it. So maybe that's part of it. I wouldn't want to speak for anybody else's country or the rules.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. That's all from me.
Thank you. I'm interested in your thoughts around data. We've heard a bit of evidence through this inquiry about how there is a real need for better data to capture the contribution of our businesses to the economy, but also like a whole bunch of things, I suppose. But I'm keen to kind of understand what data you think is missing from your perspective in terms of you being able to support your members, or even kind of be able to tell the story about what our businesses contribute to the economy.
Thank you very much, Senator. Interestingly, we've just kicked off a study with, I think, the new Yamagigigu. I'm not sure what they're called, out of Deloitte. Sorry. They're the old PIC team that have transferred into under Deloitte. We've just started what we're calling the ripple effect study around what's the economic value and true impact, the broader impact of Aboriginal businesses, particularly in the Territory. So we're using the Territory environment. It's nice and acute to have a look at that and to collect the data that's necessary for us to be able to quantify the significant impacts and the actual financial benefit of Aboriginal businesses. So there are things that we already know, like, $1 spent on an Aboriginal person, or it saves the Commonwealth, in the private sector, saves the Commonwealth like $4.10 or something like that across the country. In the Territory, that's about $6.70. We know that there's data that says non-Aboriginal people keep $1 in the country for 2 days, whereas Aboriginal people keep it in a local economy for 6 weeks. We know that there's some data already around what the IPP has generated. What we think needs to happen is a real big longitudinal study on the impacts of privately owned entities on Aboriginal employment and career growth. So I think what we would see in that is we would see accelerated pathways. We would see training for career progression as opposed to training for ticking the box, which occurs in a lot of non-Indigenous entities. So I've got to tick the box and get all these people trained. So all of our mob are trained to death and never promoted. And I think the data would tell us that actually Aboriginal businesses are progressing careers, that they're investing more money in local community and into new enterprises. I think we also need some broader longitudinal study around the wealth that's being generated and how that's being spread out. So the fact that for-profit, so we don't focus enough on Aboriginal businesses as for-profit. So looking at the generational wealth and the speed of that generational wealth being built in our for-profit sector, and actually how much money they're giving out to community, because I think it would demonstrate very much our claim that all Aboriginal businesses, for-profit or not-for-profit, are social enterprises, just by sheer default of their impact, because we are giving more back. I think more data needs to be collected around where we're accessing our capital and where we're banking. How much, I guess the revenue base of our businesses, what does that look like and feel like on a whole? What do we look like collectively in terms of the impact on the Australian economy? So there's some data around what was spent by the Commonwealth, but what's being spent in the private sector? Is there an ability to get some reporting on that more broadly and bring in those major projects and the mines and the private sector and have a look at what Aboriginal businesses are as a whole? What's their revenue impact on their jurisdiction and then the nation? And is that greater than our 3% population, and is it close to parity or is it above parity? I think those things are really important to measure. But in terms of data, I think really we don't have enough even now on the genuine impact of Aboriginal business on the economy. What is the greater economic value?
Yeah.
And our research in particular is going to be the impact on investing in Aboriginal business. So that'll be very useful moving forward to tell
that's
that story
right.
and say, government, if you're investing in this, here's the impact on the Aboriginal community and the broader economy.
Yeah.
So, win-win.
Yeah, and we're building a tool based on a number of assumptions that will be able to be used everywhere by all of the chambers, so that we can look at the national costs and the national investment and the national outputs. We've got the first component down. The Northern Territory Government funded us under sector strengthening for 150K. So if the Commonwealth would like, we just need another 150 to tidy that out and build the tool.
If we can get it matched on hand.
There's a suggested recommendation, yep. And what is it that, what did you see, I suppose? I'm interested in, what made you kind of seek out that piece of work?
I think it was just that we're telling our story so strongly at the moment, and we're having such an impact in the Northern Territory. We're actually, I think we're doing it better than everybody else. We're doing it black and we're doing it brilliantly, and we're operating in a really hostile environment. What we need is the data to go to investors with. So for us to build a capital bucket, one that will really give back to our businesses and not, scope creep and let the philanthropists decide what their outcomes are. If we can build a bucket, we need the data and the evidence that says this is why. So that's what drove us, and we couldn't find it anywhere, and no one's collecting it in the right way. But also,
we've got a limited amount of data, but it's old. We really need it updated, refreshed. So that was the whole intent behind that too. So we're using very old data, but still says, Aboriginal businesses are likely to employ Aboriginal staff.
We need to be able to quantify. White people won't give us any money if we don't give them data. Put that in the hands up.
Well, I know, and data is really important, right? It does drive lots of decisions, including decisions of government.
It's what it is.
And I think it is a really powerful tool to be able to tell the story of our mob's contribution to the economy. In an earlier answer, you referenced some of the kind of digital work that's been happening out in communities, and you kind of talked about how that's been important. Have you seen a growth in kind of economic activity in the communities because there's been greater access to the digital economy?
Look, I'd like to say yes to that. I don't think the digital economies or the infrastructure for digital economies has been unlocked well enough yet on country. Okay. I think the work for that is just starting now. What I've seen is an impact by Starlink on a number of those remotely. So Starlink's really helped that, at a very, very small micro level. It's helped connectivity. But what we're seeing is a much stronger uptake by our businesses on e-commerce platforms. So certainly people digitising and going to those and using apps and technology. We were supposed to host a session today around the AI guardrails conversation here, but the Commonwealth pulled out on Friday. They didn't get enough people to come along. So we're hosting that a bit later online, but we've been working very closely with the Federal Minister, Roland, around digital technologies, and I'm sitting on the advisory committee on that at the moment, and they're rolling out a number of free Wi-Fi to a number of different communities, and I think once that's happened, we'll focus on those communities as well, around our data collection and anecdotal data collection, just to make sure that actually it is unlocking economy.
I'll certainly be interested in hearing from you again once you've been able to kind of see some of that impact. I'll be very interested in learning some more about that. And just a small question here. What initiatives could the Commonwealth Government introduce to empower and strengthen the capacity of and capability of Indigenous businesses?
I think invest more into the hubs, or invest more into the Aboriginal-owned hubs. I'd love to see them all go out to tender in the other regions to Aboriginal ownership. I think also working with the local chambers that are doing the real work to work with the businesses and entities. As I said, supply nations existing for the corporates. whereas we're existing for the Indigenous enterprises to grow in the Indigenous economy. And so I think the Commonwealth could make sure that there's enough money for us to access and get to communities, enough funding to service those major town locations, and this would include for the other jurisdictions as well. Because if we can't get those off the ground and also unlock some of the fee-for-service potential for us to be able to do that, because people should have to pay, it's business. I don't mind if it's subsidised, and we work through models like that, and we've got a pretty good model. But if we aren't funding the remote work, we're not really unlocking the economy, and it's great to happen in the big towns and everywhere else. But if it costs us out of Darwin $1,000 return flight anywhere, even if we're going to Catherine or to Maningrida or somewhere like that, where it would cost more, it's very difficult for us to maintain that kind of energy. And we've been recognising very much that we need to unlock the models. So rather than having to employ everybody to deliver the work, we need to be able to have the capacity to outsource that. So the business is giving business. Do you know what I mean? And we're not taking it away, because also when you've got a person based in community the whole time, sometimes people get bored of it, or the politics comes into play. And what we're finding in remote community is when we're coming in and giving a good week, and they know when we're coming back and we're committed to that, and it's not fly in, fly out. We're not doing a job that's irrelevant. We're working with community, and then we're coming back, they're really excited and we're seeing good outcomes.
And so you think that it's not necessarily like a particular program or initiative, but if you fund Indigenous hubs, they can then do the bespoke stuff that supports Aboriginal businesses at a level where they need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a culturally safe way, we're almost 100% Indigenous employed here. We've got 14 people. And we're growing the skills that are necessary, and we're working with the ecosystem and the other government-funded partners in the non-Indigenous spaces. We're working with everybody to make sure we can do the right thing. So we act as a bit of a central point, like a one-stop shop. We'll help you connect to all the things that you need to, and we do provide that fierce advice that Senator Little was talking about there. They know that they're coming to us. We're going to be really mean and say that's a really bad idea. Don't do that, and these are not good partners. But that's part of what good business is. And if we can't support our people and tell them the truth, then we aren't doing a good job. Yeah, absolutely. And the other piece that we've heard through the inquiry is, and you've kind of talked about this a bit too, like there's a real challenge around access to finance and capital. Do you see there are kind of really practical things that the Commonwealth Government could do to address those challenges? Yeah, I'm not sure around that. I think, in conversations I've been having with the big four banks recently, I was sitting on a roundtable with ANZ, and, everybody wants to talk about the regulations. We've got lending regulations. There are all these rules for the banks. And the reality is everybody could carve out part of their profit and put that into a high-risk lending lane and work with Aboriginal people there, but nobody wants to do that piece. I think it's how do we unlock that with the banks and the private sector to invest the capital that's necessary, and how do we work with Aboriginal people to think about what it looks like to maybe not get capital as a grant but get capital as a loan with maybe no payback over a 5-year period when your business is ready, a 3 to 5 year period, and then the interest rates kick in and you're paying it back. I think investment and loans are really important. Access to capital like that is really important, not just grants. But it's understanding the model for Indigenous businesses. You've got to reinvest your working capital back into the business over a number of years to build it up for it to remain viable and stable. And I think the business sector is not recognising that we don't have the collateral and we don't have the intergenerational wealth to take those risks over that period of time for us to start paying back on day one.
Yeah, and interesting, because the other thing that we've heard through the inquiry is that, we operate in a high trust economy in Australia, and Aboriginal people are not the beneficiaries of that high trust economy.
No.
And that's been to our detriment, even though I think, I can't remember what study it was. Potentially it was a Melbourne University study that talked about how essentially kind of, Aboriginal businesses are more of a sure bet than non-Aboriginal businesses are, but we still have this trust deficit in the economy. And even interesting, like in your kind of talking about what the potential solutions are, putting money into a high-risk investment stream. And actually the data tells us that Aboriginal businesses are bit of a safer bet to invest in.
They are definitely.
But it's that kind of, yeah.
It's a very hard. That's what we're saying. We work in a very hostile environment, and you're absolutely right. There is a trust deficit, and the high risk pieces around non-secured loans. Do you know what I mean? Like, and we've got IBA. Like, you know, that's the other piece. I mean, unlocking the funding that IBA gets to provide business services that don't really exist in the Northern Territory would be, you know, we could deliver that work, but we don't have access to that, and we don't have access to IBA. But their lending model isn't much better than the banks. So for the Indigenous specific lender and the statutory authority, you know, owned by the Commonwealth, we're really not seeing great benefit out of that lending facility either, particularly in the business space for capital, in the Territory in particular. So I think that's another thing we need to consider too, is why is that happening? Why is the one that's geared for this still like giving us messages that say, you know, if you've got an outstanding phone bill, we won't lend you any money, you know, whereas I've got an outstanding phone bill and still have many loans with the bank.
We are out of time, and I feel like I could ask you questions for a very long time. But I would be interested in, kind of on notice, where you think some of the where you think some of those changes can be made to this, you know, the things that government do, and whether that's through kind of RBA or other places, actually realise some of the benefits that, you know, we want them to. You know, you talked about kind of IBA not necessarily, you know, doing the things it needs to be able to get more of the money they need.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, kind of on notice, to hear some of your kind of thoughts and where you've got them kind of ideas for how we can kind of approach those challenges.
I'd be happy to do that, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank you both for your attendance here today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, would you please provide it to the Secretariat by the 14th of October? You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and will have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. So thank you very much. And I also would like to thank Hansard and the Secretariat for their support today, and I declare this public hearing closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.